I think for me, as you are trying to build bridges, try not to do it too quickly. Try to have experiments together that are enjoyable and sustainable, and do it in a way that if it doesn't work, you don't burn anyone and don't hurt anybody, and you can just come back to what you were doing. We don't laugh at failure, but when things don't work, we name it and say that's a lesson. What can we learn from it, and how can we move on?
Welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to have you along with us. And of course, I have my usual co-host joining me. Tim, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Joel.
You are wearing a denim jacket.
That I am.
Good eyes, Joel.
Good eyes. Well done. Well noticed.
Well spotted. And Stu, you are wearing a very loud shirt this evening because you went to a loud concert last night.
I went to a loud concert last night and I bought a concert t-shirt, and I came home and my wife saw my new concert t-shirt and she said, "That's hideous."
I don't know if it's hideous.
Well, I think it's really cool.
For people who are on YouTube, I'll give you a little glance.
Yep. This is the t-shirt. It says Hoodoo Gurus and the Dandy Warhols on it. I'm assuming that's who you saw last night.
Yes. No, actually, we saw the Philharmonic Orchestra of Chamber Commerce.
Chamber of Commerce?
Goodness, they've got their own Philharmonic Orchestra. That's great.
No, I did go to see the Hoodoo Gurus. And it was fantastic. It's one of my favourite. Oh, actually, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to say it's my favourite Australian band.
Really?
So there you go.
I thought Radio Birdman was your favourite band.
Well, I know. I was there in the concert last night, and I'm like, you know what? I know. It's massive. Like, first time in 30 years, I've now gone and thought, I've always loved Birdman more than Hoodoo Gurus. And some of our audience are going to be going, who are these people? Google them. Do yourself a favour.
YouTube.
Radio Birdman, terrific Australian band.
Yep.
But Hoodoo Gurus, I just think
Hoodoo
last
Gurus
night's concert was the best.
Really?
It was so good. I first saw them in 1987 at Salinas at Coogee Bay Hotel with my wife Louise, who at the time we were going out. And they're a very, very cool band. They're good.
Wow.
Songs like Bittersweet.
Yep.
Tojo, Never Made It to Darwin. Miss Free Love 69.
I know that one.
Yeah, real bangers, real classics.
What's your favourite Hoodoo Guru song?
It's not, the lyrics are great, but I love Miss Free Love 69. And for years I just used to rock around and, rock into it. And then one day I read the lyrics and went, oh, okay, that's interesting.
That's a bit of a pattern with you. I remember another time we had a song and he's like, I'm going to present this song at our council. And I was like, no, don't do that one.
And then they showed me the lyrics. Yeah, I sometimes get carried away with how a song sounds. And so there you go. It's cool. The Hoodoo Gurus.
Yeah, right. Well, why did we bring up the Hoodoo Gurus? I don't even know why we're using that as a story.
We were thinking of you. I think you're being polite to start off with, but I think we were thinking of a cultural artefact.
Yes, that's true. But I was trying to think of how it related to what we're talking about, because we're talking about, our season is on momentum in ministry, and we're using that book by Tom Rainer called Breakout Churches to kind of inform how we start thinking about this. But I was trying to think about why we were actually using it, but I can't remember. Do you remember why?
I do remember. We are riffing off Tom Rainer's book and just comparing our approach to his approach. There's some similarities, some differences, just helpful to have a reference point there. But in terms of today, I think you were saying to me that you were interested in a wake-up call moment.
Yes, thank you.
And I mentioned to you that last night I was at the Hoodoo Gurus, and at one point in the concert I was so into it that I forgot what decade I was in. And when all the lights went on, I turned around and looked at everyone and went, wow, how did we get old straight away? So in my head somehow I was back in 1987, and it was like one of those what was it, the Twilight Zone episodes where you go to a concert and you're all young, and then the lights go off and you have the concert, and then they turn the lights on and everyone's instantly old. And I was like, but it wasn't so much a science fiction moment. It was actually a wake-up call, because it was like, I realised how old we're all getting. So all these fans of the Hoodoo Gurus from the 80s, we're all in our late 40s, 50s, and there was some people who were older than that there last night. So yeah, it wasn't quite a wake-up call, but there you go. I think that cultural moment was quite interesting.
Thank you for reminding me, because I forgot why we chose to talk about that. That was cool. And we are talking about momentum in ministry. We're talking about a wake-up call, as Tom Rainer likes to term it. Now, we should also make it clear that Tom Rainer's breakout churches utilises Good to Great, which is a book by Jim Collins, which is based on businesses. And sometimes we think that maybe the language is maybe a little bit too harsh occasionally, the way that we're talking about churches. But he also says that good churches do not become breakout churches until the leaders confront the reality of where the church is at. And he's talking very much as like, especially in America, he thinks that a lot of churches are on a slow decline. That's kind of something that we talked about in the previous season on evangelism, where he's talking about the Barna reshirts and where we think what that was actually revealing to us and all those kind of things. And he also says that unlike the corporate world, churches often aren't keen to review the reality that they're actually in, and then perhaps they don't understand why they're possibly declining. And it's quite some difficult language. He says they move slowly toward death, but no one is willing to make sure the patient isn't sick. So I think that's a little bit harsh on some people.
I think it's a bit harsh too.
Yeah, sometimes. But I think it's worthwhile to look at that to understand what we're trying to talk about and how we
engage with it.
Engage with it and try and develop momentum in ministry of what he's actually saying. So one of the big things he says in a major chapter is he calls the ABC moment, which is stands for awareness, belief, and then a crisis, which is almost like a process that leaders and also the church congregations will go through before they realise that they might need to make some changes. But his main point is that awareness is the first step, is realising there might need to be a change to be made. My first question to you guys is, can you think of a time when you realised you came to that point, a moment of awareness that you thought that in your ministry that you might need to change? Tim, you haven't said much. Do you want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. I'm just trying to think of a moment of that has happened.
I always like to throw you guys under the bus.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The question is the moment of awareness. Sorry.
That's okay. Do you want to go? Shoot?
Yes.
You got one?
Yes. Well, we have talked about it a fair few times, but my biggest moment of awareness was when we first started Soul Revival.
Right.
And it's the 30th anniversary of Soul Revival this year. And in the 1980s, there was a strong youth group at my church. 40 of my friends were going to youth group. But then during the 2 years after school, when everyone got their driver's license, most of my friends left one by one. And over time, it wasn't noticeable. But eventually it was very noticeable because they left gradually and stopped coming to the evening service. And in one night, I was sitting in the pew at the back of church by myself in the same pew that we had sat in right through the whole decade, sitting there passing notes back in the day before mobile phones, talking about surf, talking about bands, what bands we're going to go see and things like that. And, who was going out with who. And, we used to pack into this pew at the back of or a couple of pews at the back of the church. And we were all sandwiched in there together. And then one night, it was thinning out over time, but then one night I was sitting in the pew by myself and I looked down the pew and there was no one there. And I looked to the door and I had a realisation, a wake-up call. I don't think any of them are coming back. I think I'm it. And so I had a bit of a epiphany that I thought, well, maybe if I go too, there's not going to be anybody left in their 20s at the church. So I thought, what's going to happen to the church? And my wake-up call was, well, I suppose if someone doesn't hang around, it's always going to keep that trend moving forward, because teenagers had been leaving the church almost as a matter of course right through the late 80s and into the early 90s. So that's what got me thinking about sticking around and starting Soulies. So that was a bit of a wake-up call.
Yeah, and I think you bring that up reminds me of a little point that Rainer talks about. He says it's called a leader in a particular moment has an is/should be discernment moment, when they recognise the things how they are, and then they feel that there needs to be a change, and they clearly see what changes need to be made. And sometimes he says it's an inner conviction, and other times it's often some outside influences that reveal that to them. Sometimes people get in church consultants. I mean, Tom Rainer is a church consultant. He helps people try and get to that moment. I was just wondering, were you able to come up with an awareness moment, Tim? Or you didn't get to that point?
I was just thinking of a couple of sort of key moments that I've had of, awareness moments where I don't know if it's necessarily changed practice, but deepened practice. So one, I was many years ago teaching on the 10 Commandments, and there was one particular child who I had struggled for a number of years to kind of engage, and part of it was he was just incredibly intelligent, and everything we did kind of bored him to sobs, even when I was trying to pitch it the rest of the group. But there was a moment there where we were talking about the 10 Commandments, and we looked at the distinction between Exodus 19 and Exodus 20, and for the importance of the fact that they were being given these 10 Commandments as a saved people. And so as a saved people, now live this way. And we just talked about how we can sometimes get those in the wrong order. We can think about how we've got these lists of rules, and maybe if we follow the rules, fingers crossed, God might let us into his family, God might let us into his kingdom. But the really significant part of Genesis 20 is that Exodus 20, Exodus 19 comes beforehand, where God is saying to his people, I have rescued you on eagle's wings, and therefore this is how you are to live. And there's great parallels with Paul, where he will talk about, you have been saved by grace, and therefore now do the good works God has prepared in advance for you to do. And we're going through that, and I was confronting, communicating to the kids this truth and how important it was to get it in the right order, not the wrong order. And there was this moment of clarity in this particular child that I've been struggling to work out how to engage, that he, all of a sudden the lights came on behind his eyes and he realised, this is really significant. Now what it meant for me was, there was great joy in seeing it connect with him. But in terms of my own leadership, has just continued to help me reflect on what's the best way to continue to try and shape communication in such a way that you do help to see the transformational change in people. And in the children that we're leading, and having that awareness of really sort of speaking to the heart of the kids and being able to help them to see the practical and real pastoral implications of those kind of things. So they're the kind of the moments that I sort of think back to, that was a really pivotal moment. Wanted to work out of that, deepen my own reflection, make sure I've got really good questions that I'm engaging with, so that you can actually see this, the real shaping of discipleship.
That's a really lovely moment.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. I was going to ask the question as in regards to that, because that's that boy that you're talking about. He had the lights came on. He had his own moment of awareness. Do you I'm wondering, why do you think that some leaders in churches may push against even that awareness, like even if that awareness has been revealed to them somehow, that they might resist that in a sense? That is it because they might not be keen on the conflict that might arise from that, having to make some changes, or some leaders said in the Rainer's research that the pain was too great for the potential gain that they might get if they face reality. They'd be compelled to make changes, then that would create conflict. I'm just wondering what your response would be to that, and how do you think that we, in your experience or in the churches that you've experienced, do we actually decide to, or we don't want to actually be aware of what needs to happen?
We certainly can be. And, I trust that Rainer has done his research and he's noticing real things that happen in churches. And potentially, there's a number of people who are just naturally conflict averse. I think I would be naturally conflict averse. And so thinking about confronting people with belief changes or attitudinal changes or practice changes that were contrary to their own spiritual health and vitality is not something that I relish. I don't look and get excited about correcting people. But I think part of how we imagine ourselves as a church and our relationship to those that we lead and those that we're in ministry with is really significant. And we talked a couple of times about Rainer's using a sort of a businessy type model being based on a business book. And I talked a couple of weeks ago about my hesitation about the influence of business type language and methodology and
proof texting.
There's the proof texting issue, but even just the way that if we think about church as a business, can have some shadows and downsides that we might not intend. I like thinking about the church more in that kind of organic sense. We talk about the church being, family or body, or it's even the house image of we're all bricks being put together, those kinds of things. And what it means is that if I look at those who I'm ministering to as my brothers or sisters or family, if I've got those kind of images in mind, or even the friendship model, which Stu's talked a lot about, the ecclesiological category of friendship, then I want the best for them. And so when it comes to moments of pointing out potentially painful moments, it's done out of the love and the concern of actually wanting to see the best for that person, even if what I'm going to be pointing out or correcting in that person is painful. But it's also done in a place of love. And it's easy to think about times as a parent where you have to correct your child or shape them, discipline them in a particular way for their own good, so that they will become shaped even better as a person who we want them to be under God. And it's the same with those we minister to. It's out of a genuine concern for them. It's a love for them. And because we love them, because we genuinely want the best for them, then we are going to step into those hard moments sometimes in order to have to push against things that they believe or feel or act or do, which are not according to God's good design. I think that's important.
Stu, what do you think about the kind of dichotomy between awareness and conflict? And maybe you might want to talk about how we kind of handle that at Soul Revival, like looking to make change, but also being willing to do it lovingly among the congregation. And I just would like to get your thoughts on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that many ministers have a static strategy that they've implemented in church, and so if culture changes, the strategy doesn't have built into it a change methodology, whereas the methodology or strategy that we've taken a few years to work out is a change management strategy. And so we call it the shock absorber, which we've called the whole podcast about. But the idea is that if we bring Christians together to have a conversation about faith together as a part of our regular life together, we have a place where young people who tend to be more flexible can actually be sharing with the older people who tend to have a bit more biblical wisdom and have a bit more
life experience.
Yeah, life experience, and bring a bit of strength to the flexibility. Bringing those together in a church means that there's an ongoing everyday conversation about change. It doesn't mean that we wait for these big epochs to happen and then try and work out how we adjust to them. It's like we're always changing through iterative design because we're listening to each other. And we also try and reduce conflict between generations or different people, because sometimes in churches the young people and the adults can be conflictual over resources or over emphasis, what songs are being sung in the service, what style is the service, are there enough services and mission opportunities and discipleship opportunities for a certain age group. Whereas being an intergenerational ministry that has an iterative design, it means that we have formal moments of awareness every year, where we have a review and a planning every year on our planning day, which happens to be tomorrow in our case, actually. So that's a formal thing we put in place. Sometimes we put in formal forums for topics that come up in our culture that we're all talking about. So we're going to have a forum on what's going on with the Australian Anglican Church before the end of the year, to give people an opportunity to share their thoughts and talk about it. And then through that, we talk about ministry activity that can flow from that review process, so that we plan into the future. So tomorrow we're going to be planning for 2030, and we're going to be talking about how can we plan to continue to do discipleship, mission, and supply resources for those things together as a community. So our approach is a bit more organic, more flexible, as Tim said. But I do think sometimes it's really difficult if I've got a static model of church and I apply that really well for 5 years, and then in the next 5 years it's sort of still working, but then in 10 years' time it's not working. It's a really big thing to go, what do we do next? It's not immediately obvious, even if we did want to engage in the conflict, how we would move forward together. So I think it bodes well for churches to have some kind of ongoing place to continue to think together. And most churches have an AGM, and it's not hard to develop an AGM, for example, into a review and planning process is quite formal, but then also to create spaces where young people and older people can come together to talk about being Christian in a changing world.
I think that was a great point about the static model. I think that's where Rainer's often coming from, is that there are some static models, and he's mainly looking at American churches, that they may have some static models in there, and that's perhaps why his language is also a little bit harsher too, because he's like, no, you need the wake-up call, you need to make the change again. But the problem is, if you don't have a model that is perhaps integrating change constantly, then you need to keep making those changes that you're saying.
Yeah, it's almost like waiting for the midlife crisis and then you go and buy yourself a red sports car. Or do you actually kind of just adapt and grow as you get older? So as the church grows and gets older, they just keep being flexible and changing. But yeah, if you wait till the crisis moment to have that awareness moment. I mean, the thing about last night is, the fun thing about that concert was, it didn't shock me or shatter my worldview that there was a whole heap of middle-aged people going to see the Hoodoo Gurus. And the other thing is, they're not the only band I like. Like, you know, I was listening to Jungle on the way in. That's not the most trendy, up-to-date band, but, you know, my music has continued to change and grow as I've left the 80s. I don't just listen to 80s music anymore. But yeah, if there are churches that are still just listening to 80s music and they haven't changed since for 30 years or 40 years, whatever it is, then I think Hoodoo Gurus are celebrating the 43rd year or some crazy amount of time. But I think, just listening to new music and continuing to grow and change as you grow as a person means you avoid those midlife crisis moments, I think.
Yeah. What do you think that... we talked about like using the older saints in the church to provide biblical wisdom and help the younger crew who bring maybe some newer, fresher ideas to try and work together on that. What do you think that the spiritual maturity is part of that conversation of whether they're young or old? Like, does that factor into how willing people are, perhaps in the church, willing to make change?
I think church is messy and all of us aren't perfect. Sometimes church models put a lot of focus, rightly so, on the leadership, which this model does, of trying to work out what's going on. But my view is more influenced by Francis Schaeffer from the 1960s, where he says a leader, I think if I remember correctly, in one of his books he wrote, a leader shouldn't be seeking higher office, they should be invited to higher office. And there's a really different way that you lead if you've been invited to lead that way. Kind of has happened for me in my life. I was a youth minister by being invited to be a youth minister, and then I was a youth minister for 20 years, and then after I left Guyana Anglican Church I was invited to be a church planter. So, you know, that's really great if that's it's not to say that it's not also great for people to see a need and step up to the need and put their hand up for that. That's also really good. But these categories that Rainer seems to have of awareness, belief and crisis, I think rather than seeing that as a moment that the church needs to change in, I see it as a lifestyle of constantly being aware, constantly
being ready for change.
Being ready for change with understanding your belief set. And then when a crisis does occur, hopefully it's putting out little spot fires along the way rather than trying to put out a big bushfire, because it's incredibly discombobulating, which I love that word, when you've got to change the whole approach of things and things seem like they're going to die if you don't. I think I read something in Sydney Morning Herald this morning that said, I think it was Sydney Morning Herald, anyway, one of the papers I read this morning said that the new midlife crisis is in your 50s, and I always have a giggle when people say things like that, like 50's the new 40 and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting because we are living longer and people are sometimes putting off decisions that they would have made earlier in other generations.
I think we're trying to say younger for longer.
Yeah, I think so. So we're kind of putting off the inevitable by saying I'm still, Hoodoo Gurus are still hip and happening. Oh, they're not. They're all old. Crisis. What am I going to do with it? Well, I went to the concert expecting to see heaps of people in their 50s. So when the lights turned on, I just went, oh yeah, here's all these old dudes. Here we are together. And they were all so mature in their approach to the band that there was no moshing going on when once upon a time it was one of the most furious moshes I've ever been in. Yeah, right. So that wasn't a crisis. It was a change. So seeing changes early avoids crisis as well. So rather than that being part of my breakout moment, I personally think there's lots of little breakout moments along the way.
Tim, did you have something to add there? Or you gave the look that you were ready to go?
No, I can't even remember the question, mate.
Oh, I thought you had a point bursting out of your brain. No, you just needed to come out. Okay.
It might have burst out of his brain.
It might have it's completely burst out of his now and it's flown the coop.
Yeah, it's on its way to Cronulla. It's already passing Miranda.
Okay, cool. Thanks, man. There was a quote there in the book that he talked about Charles Spurgeon, and it's more in relation to perhaps quantifying the spiritual growth of members and if it's declining or if it perhaps is increasing. And it's quite interesting. So Charles Spurgeon says, "It has been noted that those who object to numbers are often brethren whose unsatisfactory reports should somewhat humiliate them." So numbers are probably part of the conversation, but just one helpful indicator of a church. We kind of talked about, the indicator of what the health of a church is. We talked about this previously in numbers that can form part of the conversation. But what I think we're talking about is that, again, it's this book is coming from you come to an absolute moment where you need to really dig everything up and change everything. How would we like to see that differently in terms of the numbers of the church? Are we just looking for numbers to grow up, or how do we maybe have a metric for measuring spiritual growth? Is that something that we try and do, or is it something that we kind of look to not worry too much and then just use it as part of the way that we look at our church?
Yeah, I think measuring spirituality and spiritual growth and spiritual maturity is difficult. And there's a lot of different ways that people have tried to tackle this problem. We talk about it in children's ministry all the time, and I'm often having conversations with children's ministers, particularly because children also quite likely have a spiritual maturity beyond what they themselves can articulate. And so how do you measure the spiritual maturity of a child who may have a deeper sense of Jesus and God than they actually have the words to describe? And so one of the thoughts I did have about your earlier comment about spiritual maturity and the young people and old people is it's an easy trap to fall into, to think that those who are older or have been Christians longer are actually more spiritually mature. It may not be the case. So what are you looking for when you're thinking about spiritual maturity? And the Bible gives us some indication, particularly in Paul's letters. I'm thinking of parts where he gives us the characteristics of Christians, the things that we should be putting on and putting off. So the types of people who are not angry and wrathful and licentious and all those things that the Bible tells us to put off because they are no longer part of who we are. If we've been adopted into Christ, then, and these, because we are in Christ, we are to image Christ, and therefore these are the types of characteristics that we should be putting on. And so that would be a significant measure of spiritual maturity, is how Christ-like is someone, because that is an indication of how the Spirit is working their life, the spiritual fruits that they are developing. If you use Jesus' language from John 14, 15, 16 about the vine, how deeply are they connected to Jesus? How much are they drawing their life source, their characteristics, the things that they value, the things that are important to them, the way that they are praying, all of those things will give an indication of how mature those people are. So that would be some of the things that you would be looking out for. And also knowing that because spiritual maturity is not connected to age necessarily, therefore it wouldn't surprise us that there might be some young people in the church who are more spiritually mature than people who are generations older than them. And that is one of the reasons I think that intergenerational church is so significant, where there's a humility to listen to those of other generations, because there may be people, even those who are younger than you, that actually may have insight into God, His world, His word that you have not considered. And so part of the mutual co-contribution that comes through intergenerational church is that recognition that God can be working in His Spirit to bring alive and to mature people of all different ages at different seasons of their life. So there would be some of the indicators, and that was thinking about that. In terms of the number question, I think the numbers are not always a good metric, because we would expect that in a non-Christian world, there is going to be antagonism and pushback against the gospel. And yet we also know that in God's good creation, when we do communicate the gospel well and we apply it to the lives of the world, that people will see and be attracted. So there's a key verse where it talks about the gospel being the essence of life to many and the stench of death to many. And so we would expect that as we go about faithful ministry and we're faithfully communicating the gospel, that it will be really attractive to many. And by God's grace, he does work on the hearts and minds of people to unblind their eyes and to call them to himself through the ministry of the local church. So we should see numbers grow from that point of view. But we will also see people who hear the gospel and think of it as the stench of death and walk away. And so it's not a one-for-one correspondence that faithful ministry therefore equals growth in numbers. And the other thing we talked about a couple of weeks ago is you can artificially or unfaithfully grow numbers by doing other things that are not gospel ministry.
Free beer.
Yeah, if you had free beer at church every week, you'd have a lot of people there that may not actually be interested in Jesus at all.
But they're interested in the beer.
That's right. And I mean, this is a conversation we have, thinking about youth ministry. We have our...
By the way, we're not advocating to...
We are not advocating for free beer. No.
Just wanted to say that just in case someone takes that out of context. Sorry, Tim, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. No, but I think the immediate context for us is, I mean, we've got a couple of our staff members right now who are out at local high school and they run a lunchtime group, which is called Chip Lunch. And often, not every week, they take some hot chips with them. And for 30 years, Stu, you've been involved more or less in these kind of ministries, and there has always been the case that there are teenagers who want to go for the hot chips and aren't interested in Jesus.
We call them seagulls.
Seagulls, yeah. There's lots of seagulls around the outside. And so you do have, and so if you've got something that is interesting, you may have a really large lunchtime group at your school because you provide tons of hot chips. Now, is that large number representative of faithful ministry? It's actually they're not necessarily connected, and so what we want to see is long-term fruitfulness, and there's going to be other metrics other than numbers. So I think Spurgeon is helpful, and I think we want to be able to nuance that in a lot of different ways.
I think a couple of things I'll say to that is sometimes we can hide behind that too, though. We can say, if that ministry is growing, they must be just offering free beer. And you're definitely
really cynical about it, which is and unhelpful.
Also, the phrase of "is it real ministry or not?" I think sometimes crowds come to the gospel. Crowds come to a carol service. Crowds come to Christmas and Easter. It doesn't mean that because there's lots of people there that aren't actually interested in living for Jesus, it's not a fruitful ministry. Well, and you're not saying that. But,
no. I just wanted to sort of also illustrate that by saying that massive crowds follow Jesus.
Well, I was about to go there. That's what I was about to say.
Right,
Because we can't say Jesus didn't have a faithful ministry because he was offering free food, because a lot of people went for the free food and miracles, and that wasn't making his ministry unfaithful. That wasn't bad growth. I mean, again, Rayner's, helpfully trying to get some boundaries and some reference points, but we've got to be careful to say that because something's big and there's a lot of people who've come for chip lunch who aren't Christians doesn't mean it's necessarily an unfaithful bad growth. The thing about our ministry at the school at the moment is you have swings and roundabouts with that we've taken chips to the school so that we can sit down and have a meal together at the school, because it's a portable meal. It's really easy to use. When too many people come along just for the chips, we just stop taking chips and saying, well, the main thing we're here for is fellowship and to read the Bible together. And if you're keen to do that, you can have some chips with us too, but we're not here to attract you all with the chips. But they think that's what we're doing because we live in a consumeristic society where people market things all the time, and they throw out some freebies and they misinterpret chips as an advertising device. Excuse me. So I think what you're saying is really good,
and that's another good discernment, like on the hearts of those students who come, because what we communicate by not taking the chips for a couple of weeks is actually the most important thing. The most important thing that's always been here, whether we have chips or not, is that we want to know you and introduce you to Jesus. And for some, that's going to be, actually, it was really nice getting the chips, but I can see that these people genuinely care about them and they actually really want me to know Jesus. I'm going to take that invitation seriously, and they're going to dig deeper. And then there's going to be those who say they weren't really here for the chips, they were really here to introduce me to Jesus, I want none of that, and they'll walk away. So that the act of bringing the chips sometimes, not bringing the chips sometimes, helps each of those individual students who come to discern for themselves how seriously they're going to take the faithful ministry that is happening every week, and it just kind of highlights that as well.
And if they've never been to church before and they come along, of course they're not going to come along to serve Jesus first.
No, of course
they're
not.
going to come and check it out, and that's okay. The other thing is that Jesus gave the fish and chips to all the crowds. Well, it's bread and fish, but I like the fish and chips analogy. But he did that out of compassion, right?
Salt.
Yeah, well, he did it out of compassion. He had compassion on the crowds. They didn't have anything to eat, so he fed the crowds. So he wasn't using it as a vehicle to try and get them to come and follow him. He was teaching them in the midst of that. Two more things I'd like to say is, one is that sometimes we can over-spiritualise smallness as well. We can say, we're only really serious about the gospel if we're getting together with 4 or 5 people and we're really studying the Bible together, which is good. But if we're going to disciple committed Christians, we'll be on mission together. And when we're on mission together, just as you said before, if Jesus is the vine and we are part of the vine, then we will bear fruit, and we'll bear much fruit. And part of that fruit is we'll tell others about Jesus, and part of that fruit will be some will respond. So I do think we need to build in growth in numbers into our equation. There are some lean times in the history of the church where the culture is so hostile to the gospel, particularly in countries around the world where persecution is quite intense and it's actually quite difficult to grow. I mean, in the early church, there was times where people weren't allowed to go to church until they proved they were a Christian, because it was so dangerous to just invite anyone to come along to church that if the Romans found out where the church was, they'd come in and arrest everyone. So there's different things for different times. But I would say that we can't be trapped into thinking that small is good and large is not good as well. I think that's interesting. And the second point I'd make is that in my thoughts, the actual structure or the way or the style that a church is run needs a certain critical mass. So if a church is running like a Bible study, it doesn't matter if there's 4 people coming and they bring one non-Christian friend. But if you've set up to pay the rent of a place or keep a building going, pay a staff member, run a service, then it does need a certain number of people to run that. And I think what happens in a crisis point for some churches is the model they've set up themselves isn't sustainable with less people. Yep. So rather than it being, a theological question about big or small, it's actually a practical question about, can we actually run a service based on the number of people we've got? And unfortunately, when a church hits that crisis moment, that is a wake-up call, because they're like, well, we don't have enough money, or we don't have enough this. And sometimes, sadly, churches don't know where to go, and they've only got in their mind to keep the static approach running until it doesn't have enough people to run it anymore. And that's happens in many occasions too.
That was going to be my next question, really, is related to kind of structure. And he says that, Tom Rainer says again, is that there's humility. Humility is a key characteristic of what he terms a level 6 leader. And he uses an example of a leader in a church who he put it down to his independent Baptist upbringing in terms of independent church that he was at. He felt that he had to do everything himself. But it does say that churches continue to manage to grow when they have actually built structures within themselves that can actually raise up lay leadership underneath it. I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that and what we've learnt from since we started Soul Revival Church in doing that. One of my favourite things about leadership is it comes from a business background, but it's like the role of one of the main roles of you as a leader is to make yourself redundant in terms of people can step up and take on some of your roles, so then you can continue to expand what you're able to do. Is that something that we should look at as church leaders as well? And also, what do we do at Soul Revival and via the shock absorber method to create those structures and raise up people into leadership?
I think that there are lots of different models for pastors to raise up ministers. I think Ephesians 4 talks about the fact that there are pastors so that we can raise up people for ministry, and I think it's a really good thing to do. Some of it's personality based. Different personalities have different ways of doing it, but there are structures and there is people work, so we do need to have structures that are commiserate with the size of the gathering that we've got. And at Soul Revival, we've kind of, maybe for another time, another podcast, but we've come up with a 3-step structural process based on different sized cars. So we've talked about a very small gathering of maybe a Bible study being like a Vespa, like those little motorbikes that run around. They have wheels and an engine and a steering wheel, but they don't have much more, and a seat, and that's all they need for a small group of people. But if you then get more people coming to your Bible study, you need to maybe move towards starting a formal service. Then we're saying, maybe, 25 to 60 people is kind of like bare minimum. 50 is kind of like a, sort of sustainable size, but you want to even be growing beyond that to say 80, I think, in what we would call a beetle. So that's almost like your first car. And then the third step is if that grows to become bigger again and you've got a bigger formal service that's now starting to get big enough to even send out other church plants, you're talking, 150 to 200 people. So we've tried to look at those three different size churches, apply this metaphor of these three different cars, and then work through what sort of ministry teams do we need for each of those different size groups of people. And if any of the listeners or viewers are interested, we could get you some more information about that. Done a bit of thinking about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good thing to keep thinking about. The other thing is talking about Tom Rainer's kind of ABC moment. He goes from awareness, so realizing that something needs to happen, then belief. Some people think, do I need to do this? Some leaders can really find it difficult. He says to look at some of the great stories of faith in the church to be able to keep going, which I think is a really good encouragement to get out of the book. My last question is related to the crisis moment that he talks about, and we can wrap the podcast up after this, I suppose. But Rainer talks about there's a higher cost to moving churches forward. I think that we've kind of said that we hope not to get to that point as a church because we're trying to institute change or bring about change a little bit quicker than perhaps what a static model would allow. But there is still a high cost to making changes. I know, Stu, last week you talked about at times thinking, you had a couple of times in your ministry where you thought it was over. I'm just wondering what changed as an encouragement to any leaders that are listening to this and like thinking, this is going to be difficult if I want to make some change. Yeah,
so bringing the team together to have a conversation, discerning how many of us are keen to continue to persevere is really important. And the second thing I like to do is continue to do what was working, even if it's not working as well, and then build a bridge to a new reality so that if that new thing I'm doing doesn't work, I can come back to being where I am. So I don't sort of have a static model where, this static model's not working anymore, let's burn that to the ground and start a new thing. What I like to do is keep this going, whatever A is, build a bridge to B, and then if B works, we move over the bridge to B. But if B doesn't work, B comes back and moves over to A again, and we look for a new idea. So sometimes you've got to build 3 or 4 bridges before you work out something that might work. And then sometimes it only kind of works. So then you can keep the two things going at the same time until you adjust
Go
together.
Back and forward over the bridge.
So also having patience and not panicking is really important at that crisis point, and not losing your composure. There's one of my favourite movies is an anti-war movie called A Bridge Too Far, which ironically is kind of talking about this bridge concept. And it was about in the Second World War, the Allies tried to move too quickly to end the war because obviously they wanted to finish it because it was becoming so protracted and bloody and was getting worse and worse every year. So one of the generals, this guy called Montgomery, thought, why don't we actually just have this like lightning movement across Holland from France and then get round into the Ruhr Valley in Germany, and then the war will be ended.
Operation Market Garden?
Market Garden, yeah. It was actually a big disaster because they parachuted in all these regiments to certain bridges, and then the tanks were supposed to come up the roads and liberate those bridges as they went. And they did right up until Arnhem, but Arnhem Bridge was just one bridge too far. They went a bit too fast. And the thing about that movie that really strikes me is even when that was failing at the Arnhem Bridge, they interviewed the commanding officer of the British paratroopers that were at that bridge fighting this rearguard action by this stage, where they had to retreat back across the Rhine to get away from, because they weren't able to get the supplies to them. And in the movie, he's shown, running around in the rubble, and they're all fighting each other, the two sides. And apparently when the movie was made in the 1960s, this officer who was there at Arnhem had escaped and survived, and he was actually an older man by the 60s. And he went to the premiere of the movie, and the reporter said to him after the movie, "What did you think of the movie, sir?" And he said, "It's very realistic, except the bit where they had me running around under fire." He said, "I never ran around under fire, I only walked under fire." And so apparently the fact that they showed him running across the road when there was people shooting at him was not right. He would walk across the road. And they said, "Why did you walk around, sir?" And he said, "Well, I didn't want to show fear in the face of the enemy, and I also didn't want to scare my own troops by running around." And I think sometimes leaders can be running around under barrage of a crisis and actually forget the impact that has on everybody else in their team. And interestingly, they then interviewed the director and said, well, if you knew that he didn't run around, why did you depict him running around? And the director said, we didn't think people would believe it. We think it would look too Hollywood. So we wanted to make it more realistic by having him running around on under fire, because we didn't think the audiences would believe it. So I think for me, as you are trying to build bridges, try not to do it too quickly. Try to have experiments together that are enjoyable and sustainable, and do it in a way that if it doesn't work, you don't burn anyone and don't hurt anybody. And you can just come back to what you were doing. We don't laugh at failure, but when things don't work, we name it and say that's a lesson. What can we learn from it, and how can we move on? But the other thing is, for us as leaders during crisis, we need to walk under fire as best we can. And if we're not coping under the crisis, we need to reach out to get help from other people who can support us, so that we can do the best we can to walk under fire.
Yeah, I think that was a fantastic way to end it. A very legacy leader moment. Again, thank you very much. I'm not making fun of you. That's an encouraging moment. Thank you.
No worries, mate.
Thank you very much for joining us on the Shock Absorber again. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone listening or watching. Please join the conversation. If you would like to keep talking about the things that we're talking about, we'd love you to register for the Shock Absorber conference, which is on the 29th of October this year. Come and check that out on shockabsorber.com.au. You can always email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au, and jump on the Discord too if you're keen to keep chatting about it. As always, we like to thank our producer Dave, who is behind the camera. You may not be able to see him, but he's always there doing an excellent job recording and editing for us. And once again, I'll thank Tim and Stu for your time. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Joel. It was really good.
No worries. Thanks. It was a fun conversation. We've got to keep it up.
Okay.
And we'll finish that up with the one way.
One way.